Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another webinar here at D2. Today, I've got Daryl with me again. Hey, Daryl, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Jeremy. How about yourself?
Oh, not too bad at all. And today, I guess we're working on tracking your board's activity. And you've got a little special treat for us today, too.
Yes, this is a very important topic. I'm looking forward to the presentation.
Very cool. So, I'm going to start off with a very simple question. We'll get to the other questions later like we normally do, but why is it so important to track our board's activity? Isn't that just like pedantic stuff?
It could be, it should be, but often is not. Quite frankly, Jeremy, it's one of those typical items that boards tend to ignore, and they leave it to chance in some of these actionable items that they need to be following up on.
Very cool. So, why don't you take us through tracking our board's activity, why, and then walk us through how to do it.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Welcome, everyone. This is a very important presentation, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. Unfortunately, many boards do not complete a board action report of all their activities that they do throughout the year. And this has a tendency to cause a board meeting to be ineffective. So today, as a result of some of the recent responses and feedback that we received, I'm going to talk about the board action report in detail. Specifically, I want to address three areas. One is, why is it so important for the board meeting and for the board in general? Two, who was responsible for this document and maintaining it and updating it and bringing it forward to the board meeting agenda? And three, what does the actual report look like? And we have a sample report that we'll talk about a little later in this presentation. So let's get right at it. Why is this board action report so important? Many boards, as I said before, do not complete this report, and it leaves them vulnerable to missed opportunities. It's important that the board address all of its activities and actions throughout the year, which are numerous in nature. Some of these actions happen right at the board meeting through board discussions. They've come up with something they want to do. And others are more repetitive in nature, where they must happen over the course of the year, either on a monthly basis, quarterly, or even on an annual basis. It's important that all of these be addressed and followed up upon. If you don't, it could leave the board in a very precarious position. And I'll give you an example later on in the presentation of what I experienced in one of the boards I was on, where there was a missed opportunity, and this board did not have a board action report to follow up on. And if an item is missed, it can leave the board meeting agenda ineffective. It could leave that particular item ignored for an undue length of time and maybe even forever. If that happens, it could cause the board to be seen as not as efficient as it needs to be, particularly by donors. And that's one of the more important areas that all boards need to be aware of. They need to ensure that donors feel that the board is competent, and that is often through the board meeting process. If that doesn't happen and the board misses an important item and it gets to a donor or two, they could withdraw their support. And if a donor withdraws their support, it could cause irreparable damage to the organization going forward. So it's very important that all items are included in this action report, that they are followed up upon appropriately, and they find their way in an agenda for an appropriate board meeting decision or review. So that's the reason why the board action report is completed. Now I want to talk a little bit about who's responsible for this report. And it's not just the executive director, as some may feel. It's the corporate secretary who's responsible for a lot of the corporate work for the organization and ensuring the board meeting agenda is as effective as it possibly can be. So generally following every board meeting or shortly thereafter, within a reasonable period of time, the corporate secretary and the executive director would get together to determine if there are any items that happened at the board meeting, their most recent board meeting, that need to be included in the action report. Sometimes a decision could have come forward to do something, and the board needs to follow up on that in an appropriate time. It could be 1 or 2 or 3 meetings later. It's important that that does not get lost and gets included immediately into the board action report for follow-up. The other area that the executive director and the corporate secretary will review is what is going to be included in the next board meeting. So there are going to be items that are coming forward or need to come forward in the next board meeting, and they would capture those and highlight those. So that gives the executive director the opportunity to complete any work, any reports, any follow-up action that's needed prior to the board meeting, and more importantly, prior to disseminating the information of the board meeting package during the next board meeting. And for clarification, that should be done 10 days prior to the board meeting. All information should be in the hands of board members. So when you review those actionable items, the executive director now knows, and corporate secretary now knows what is going to be included in the agenda. So then when the executive director and the corporate secretary and the board chair get together to set the agenda, those items from the board action report can be brought forward to the agenda specifically. That way nothing gets missed, and now you have an agenda that's very, very appropriate and conclusive. It's important to know that there will be repetitive items no matter what, which I'll talk about a little bit later when I go over the report, but there's also going to be some new items that need to be brought forward as well. Now let's go right into what does this report look like and why should these items be included. So, one of the items that you need to be aware of is that when you're setting this document up, you need to put in place the date that the initial item was approved, and that is usually a board meeting in previously. It could be just the last board meeting if it's a new item, or it could be last year if it was the planning session. No matter what the date is, that needs to be put in as a reference point for the item. There should be a brief description of the item. That brief description will address what exactly we are talking about. But you don't need to be a very long and drawn out definition. It just needs to be a brief overview of why that decision or what that decision is. The next area should be when was it last reviewed and when should be brought forward to the board. That way you know, those are 2 key dates. You know that those dates are going to be important for future follow-up and future board meeting agendas. And finally, you should have the responsibility set out. Who is responsible for that? And in most cases, it's either going to be the corporate secretary, if it's a governance-related matter, the executive director, if it's a operational-related matter. And they would make sure that those items are completed and provided to the board well in advance of the board meeting. Typically, this document will be segregated into a couple of areas. One would be new items that came forward from a board meeting that you have recorded in the action report, and it's now going to be a follow-up opportunity at a future board meeting. Another area is going to be repetitive items, and some of these repetitive items would be things like financial reports. Some of those financial reports will be either on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, depending on the preference of the organization. Another repetitive item could be a compliance report coming from the executive director, or it could be coming from the operations manager to the board. And that would be either on a quarterly basis, and some of them are done on an annual basis, depending again on the preference of the board. There are other items that would be included that are repetitive in nature, and they could be the external auditor meetings, the external auditor pre-scope meeting, and the external auditor post-meeting where the financials have been completed. Those usually happen the end of the quarter, or the last quarter of the year, in the first quarter of the following year. Those are important items to be followed up on. And another is the annual report. getting ready for the annual report. It could be a pre-meeting on the annual report early in the last quarter. There could be the finalization of the annual report in the first quarter of the following year. That way, it's not lost, and those kinds of preparation activities are followed up upon. These are just some of the items that would be included. There is a final one that I would segregate, and that's on a governance nature. And those are specifically to do with governing policies. It's important to understand that governing policies need to be reviewed periodically. Some of them are reviewed on an annual basis, some on a biannual basis. Whichever the case is, having those policies identified in the board action report and when you want to bring them forward is important. And bringing them forward periodically, not all at once. Some may be monthly, some may be quarterly, but doing it over a period of time so that the board is not overwhelmed. The corporate secretary is responsible for first reviewing those policies to determine if there's any actions that are necessary. Does the policy need any amendments, any updates? And if not, is it just a matter of a quick review at the board meeting? That's important to understand. And as I said, the corporate secretary oversees those governing policies. But these are the key items that would be included in the report. So Jeremy, do we have a copy of that report that we could show?
I was just going to say the same thing. We've kind of prepared that for folks. So let me pull that up for everyone here so we can take a peek. And Daryl, you can kind of give us the 10,000 foot view. I'll jump in too because I'm interested to figure out how to use this out.
Well, as you can see on the report, this report that we put in place is an Excel spreadsheet that we're using for the purposes of this webinar. You can use an Excel worksheet if you want. It's very easy to do, or you can just purchase a task type of management type of software if you wish. Choice is yours, and for my preference, I use or an Excel web work page, which I find very easy to do because there's not a lot of activity to it, so it's very simple to use. So in this particular document, at the very top, we show the date reviewed, and we're using today's date. Obviously, it's a board meeting date, but generally speaking, this will be reviewed at least 10 days prior to the board meeting. That way, any information that comes from this document will go to the agenda and it gets out to the board meeting well in advance so that all board members are prepared. And of course, your organization would be to the far right, so it's personalized to your particular organization. You will also notice that it's set up with it, as I had mentioned earlier, the action item, the date it was approved, which could be the board date or could have been a special meeting, the date last updated, and the completion date once it's finalized, because when it's completed, you want to note that so it's no longer relevant to be on this board action report going forward. And usually I would remove all completed items at the end of the year. That way you can see it in, what's been completed throughout the year. But once the year is finalized, I would start afresh and remove those particular completed items. And you can see the cycle. Is it a monthly report? Is it a quarterly report? Or is it an annual report? So here's an example of a new item. Hold a special meet and greet with donors. So the board came up with this at the last board meeting in October. And you would see that at the October 17th board meeting. When is it going to be updated? Well, we don't know yet because it's just very recent. But what the executive director and corporate secretary would do is to identify what's an appropriate date to have that meet and greet and what kind of preparation work is necessary to send out invitations. And some boards do this as a best practice in having a meet and greet with key donors, and it keeps them very engaged in the organization and is important to recognize their contribution to the organization. So once that date is decided upon, it would be, the date updated could be the date of brought to the board, and there would be a notation made that the actual event is going to be held on this particular date at this particular venue and at this particular time. Another item, a new item, was board training. So this particular board meeting, the board decided that there was a training session that was required on conflict of interest. some boards had, members had brought this up as an issue, that they were a little concerned on what is a true conflict of interest. So there's going to be a bit of a training session to discuss what that looks like, starting with the actual governing policy on conflict of interest. Always your starting point, and reviewing that document and talking about specifically what is and what isn't a conflict of interest, so that boards are really familiar with what that looks like on a go-forward basis. And again, this was last updated October 17th, because it came up at the September board meeting. In October board meeting, there was a brief discussion that this is going to be held probably in the later part of the year, and once they get the date concluded on what it's going to be, they will have that training session. It's important to note that a training session should be done separately from the board meeting, because you don't want to mix the two of them together. You still want to conduct your board meeting and get the business of the board completed. Have a training session on a special day where everybody can be relaxed and really spend the time that's necessary to really review that particular area. So let's talk about some recurring items that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And here's an example: is strategic plan update. Now the strategic plan was approved on October 2023. And so it was just done in this particular year. And usually the strategic plan that could have been just the business plan update as well. But once the strategic plan is approved, there should be a minimum quarterly update, and you would be prepared for the quarterly review of what that looks like. And on a quarterly basis, you would talk about the action items that you started, that came out of the strategic planning session, and what your progress is to date. And generally speaking, you would have those action plans over a period of up to 3 years. That way it gives the organization time to adapt well to the changes from the strategic plan, as opposed to doing everything all at once. Take one at a time and work on those over the course of the year. And by year 3, you should have the bulk of the actionable items from the strategic plan completed. But this will keep that at the forefront for the board to receive that report. I'll talk about another piece, and that would be the board self-assessment. That's a recurring item that the board should do its own self-assessment no less frequently than annually. This way, the board will keep on top of its progress in improving its skills in governance. And generally speaking, that's done annually, and it is usually done with an independent facilitator. That way, it takes away from either the executive director or the board chair conducting that self-assessment process. And it's usually anonymous, and it's usually by way of a questionnaire, and it will identify the strengths of the board as well as the weaknesses of the board, but also put in place with the weaknesses some of the training plans or training initiatives that should be brought forward, and those training initiatives will then find their way into this board action report as well. So those are just some of the items on the recurring piece. Now let's talk about some of the governance items. So if you look at here, you can see some of the policies that I showed. They're, depending on how many government policies, you could have them all listed there, frankly. And some of those would be included in a monthly review. Some will be over a period of the 12 months. So say you have 12 policies you wanted to review this year, you can set them up in one every board meeting. It makes it very simple and very easy to do. Because keep in mind, the board is going to review those at the board meeting, but so is the corporate secretary prior to the board meeting. So it's important to note that it gives both parties enough opportunity to review them in detail, so that it's a quality review and reapproval decision that's made by the board. So essentially, that is what a board action report can look like. And whichever item that you decide to use, whether it's an Excel worksheet format or it's a task management software, doesn't matter, as long as you have that in place. And like I said at the start of this webinar, many organizations do not have this in place. And some of these organizations have probably met with some frustration when some of these were missed. I'll give you an example that I experienced. I was with a board where we were getting ready for a planning session. So the board had discussed the planning session. It's just something that they discuss every year. And what are we going to do in this business planning session? And when are we going to have it? Where are we going to have it? And are we going to use the same facilitator? Everybody agreed at the particular board meeting when we were going to have it and where. And we were going to use a facilitator that the board was very familiar with, who had done facilitation for the board previously. So that was the end of the board meeting. No follow-up. All of a sudden, at a scramble, it came up late in the year. When are we having our board planning session? The board had forgotten about it, so had the executive director. It wasn't captured anywhere simply because there wasn't an action report. So the board said, well, we'll have it next month. So they had to have it this particular year. It's late in the year, and we need to be finalized this year before the start of the new year. So they said next month. So we contacted the facilitator, who was unavailable. That facilitator who they were comfortable with was just not familiar, was not available for that date, nor for the rest of the year, because of other facilitation sessions that they had prearranged. So now we had to find another facilitator, which took us some time, somebody that we didn't know, and chances are, if you find a facilitator that late in the year, you may want to question whether they are busy or not, and are they the one that you really need. But the board chose that individual. So they had their facilitation session and with this facilitator, but the planning session wasn't as smooth as the previous ones, and it caused some frustration with the board, so much so that they questioned some of the actionable items that came out of it. And the session was done. We had supposedly a new action plan to bring forward to the next year and beyond. But the board felt uncomfortable with that particular item going forward. They just didn't feel comfortable every time we brought forward a quarterly review. The question came up was, are those the right action plans? We didn't really feel comfortable with that session. So it brought up some bit of frustration and dissension among the board of whether we should have done that or whether we should do another one. So that's just one example. When you have that example, and if those particular action plans were not appropriate, say, and they do find its way out to donors, it could cause some confusion with donors and potentially some reputational risk. So, as I said before, always put the donors at the forefront of the action plans that the board is doing, regardless, at board meetings or any session. So, having a board action report is extremely important, and I encourage you, if you do not have one, to put one in place as soon as possible. Thank you.
All right, Daryl. Thanks for taking us through that. I'm going to pull up the document again, because I know just going through it, I had a couple questions. Let me pull that back up here. Here we go. So, who should have access to this? Who should be making changes to it? How often should I be doing it? You know, just some best practice stuff, really, I think.
Best practice is that this document should be updated every month as a minimum, and it should be updated following as close as to the end of the last board meeting. So if the board meeting was on the 17th, which today is a Friday, and then the board has its meeting today, then sometime next week it should be reviewed within a week after. That way, any items that were on the minutes from the board meeting that need to be actioned should be included in the report and updated onto the report. And then also, it will be an opportunity to review what are some of the items that we need to be bringing forward to the next board meeting. And that gives everybody the ample opportunity to get all the reports and follow-up that's necessary prior to the next board meeting. Now, who should have access to it? The corporate secretary is ultimately responsible. And can the board have access? Absolutely. It's not something that you would include necessarily in a board agenda or a board information package, but it's something that would be available to any board member that wanted it. And in some boards, best practices have a site, a dedicated page on that they have for all board actions and activities. And this report could be updated and put on that that site for board access so that they can see where, what it's looking like, and if they see that something is missing or something that's not on there that they need to bring forward, they can to a board meeting as well.
Okay, so the other thing I'm going to ask is, there's a whole section in here around cycle, when these items should be, and is it something I can have where certain things are done in multiple cycles? How do you typically find that's best used?
Yeah, exactly. There are some on a cycle that are done on a monthly basis. So that's going to be at every board meeting, such as financial reports. Or in some cases, some organizations only want their financial reporting done on a quarterly basis. So on that cycle, you would pick each quarter, knowing that item has got to be on each quarter. Now, then you determine which board meeting in the quarter that you want it to be at. And generally, it's the month following the quarter end. So in this particular case, if the quarter ended September and that financial report was due for the quarter in September, it would generally come forward in the October 17th board meeting, the very next month.
The other thing I notice in here is we have a responsibility column, probably the most important column in the document, I think. Who should be seeing this? Should I be giving this out to my board?
If you are the person responsible for a particular item, you should get that document so that you know that you have to get the information up to and ready for the next board package to go out well in advance. And I keep mentioning well in advance because that's important. Because if it's not in advance, well in advance of the board meeting, then board members do not have an opportunity to review it and be informed prior to the board meeting. So if you're responsible, if it's for preparing this, if it's the CEO or executive director, if it's the corporate secretary, or sometimes it's the op manager, whoever is responsible for any particular item needs to be aware of what they have to do and when this is coming forward. So those particular individuals should always receive a copy of the report.
The other thing too is the completion date is probably their guiding piece. They know when they have to have it done by, which leads to kind of the next question is, if I'm a new board or a new board chair and I'm not used to setting these kinds of dates, what are some guidelines? Do you have any kind of advice for me when I come to setting completion dates and that sort of thing?
Well, completion dates are usually decided upon at a board meeting, and some of the repetitive items are pretty easy because they're either going to be monthly anyways or on a quarterly basis. But some of the newer items that come forward, it's important to understand that some of these may take time. And usually with the executive director there and the rest of the board, you're discussing what is on your plate over the next period of time, so you don't want to get overwhelmed. Sometimes there's a tendency by boards to always be identifying projects that they want to bring forward, and that's okay to do, but it's important to understand that they need to be paced over the course of the year, because there's a lot of items that are coming forward every month and every quarter, and you don't want to be overwhelmed, and you want to give ample opportunity for who's ever responsible to be able to complete these tasks in a reasonable time frame and effectively as well.
Very good. I'm going to take a look and see if we had any questions here. We got a couple in here. What happens with the board action report after the board meeting? I think we kind of touched on that a little bit, but
yeah, we did, and basically it's just reviewing that in a timely manner after the board meeting to add any items that need to be prepared, and you can either do it at this meeting or the next meeting, or maybe a week before the following meeting, in reviewing what needs to be brought forward. But generally, I would recommend as a best practice you do both, relatively soon after the meeting, because you need to give everybody ample opportunity to prepare what needs to be prepared prior to the next board meeting.
So the big question that everyone has, what do I need to do to put this into practice in my board? How do I use this? I mean, I know one of the first steps we're taking is we're going to offer this document that you've created for free. It'll be in the show notes, either on Facebook or YouTube, wherever you are. There should be a link to get this, make a copy of it, run with it. But what are some of those, how do I make sure I get the most out of this?
Yeah, it's important that that you put this in place, and many, as I said before, that many boards do not have this in place. When something happens, that's when they realize, well, we got to be following up on these items more closely. So what do we got to do? So they'll put something in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. But it's best practice. Do it now. And if you're a board right now, a board member, and you don't have this in place, you need to bring this forward to your board as a best practice. And you need to discuss that you've seen this in action as a best practice, either on a previous board that you've been on, or even on this work, on this webinar. Whatever the reason, you need to bring it forward to your board and ask to pass a motion, if you have to, that we will create a board action report in future. And once that motion is passed and agreed to, then it becomes mandatory.
If I'm a board member and I'm on a board that doesn't have one of these, should I be afraid?
Well, unless you guys keep very, very good records by following every meeting minutes, and that's basically what you would have to do, is go through all the meeting minutes and trying to make sure that you're covering everything. Some people just have a notebook. Whatever, you just need to ensure that you have all the areas covered. And if you are concerned at all, then that's the reason to bring it forward to the board. How do we know? And just ask that question. How do we know we have everything captured of all previous meetings that need to be brought forward to this board, so that we are in compliance and we are seen as being an effective and diligent board? And once you ask that question at a board meeting, it'll create some very interesting dialogue, which would hopefully lead to putting this in place.
Absolutely. Well, I think that covers this one. Like I said, folks, this document will be available in both the Facebook live feed from this. We'll put that in the, we'll pin the comment to it so you guys can find it nice and quickly. Same thing over on the YouTube channel, and we'll have it on the website where you can go and find any of our back catalog of any of the other topics that Daryl and I have been able to cover from here, before and into the future. So thanks for joining us. If you're looking to find out what we're up to, go to d2sup.com, where Daryl teaches many courses on board governance and takes us into the finer points on how to get the most out of our board. Make sure it runs like clockwork, right, Daryl? I think that's pretty...
Absolutely. Governance is so important, and I encourage you to take action if you're not comfortable with your governance activities.
Last thing coming up is we have our next webinar. It's set for December the 8th, same time as this one. It's 1:30 Atlantic, so you can do the calculations from there. Add it to your calendar. We'll have that up on Facebook here in the coming days. Daryl, you know what we're talking about that day. Why don't you give us a sneak peek? What are we covering?
We're going to cover the dismissal process of a board member. We've had some feedback on that, and when I talk about when a board member is being disruptive, that sometimes you may end up having to go to a dismissal of that particular individual. And so the feedback that we've received is, so how do you do that? What's the process? So I'm going to run through that with the board, what the board's responsibilities are, and how you put that process together. So that'd be a very, very important and very sensitive area that we're going to discuss on the 8th.
Sounds like a plan to me. I'm looking forward to that one. Last thing I'll mention, folks, is if you have a question, you are watching this in a replay, can't come to a live one, and you want to send us a question and you want us to answer any board governance question, whether it's how to deal with an unruly board member, how to do certain types of policies, whatever it is you're trying to figure out in your board, send them our way. Go to d2sup.com, d2sup.com, and you can go to the contact us, shoot us a question there, and we'll save them for the next time Daryl and I get together. So until then, thanks for joining us, and Daryl, thanks for taking us through another topic.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody.